Hello and welcome to another episode of Why the Beatles Matter. This is Sean Gaylord here for episode 3 of our podcast series on all things Beatles. It also serves as the companion piece to the course that I am teaching for High Point University, which I'm excited for. And I'm also excited to really have somebody who has been a beacon of light for me for close to 30 plus years as a fan of the Beatles. And I was very fortunate to meet our guest in person a few years ago at the Fest for Beatle fans in New York. And I welcome Al Sussman. Al is the executive editor of Beatle Fan Magazine. More on that later. He is also the author of Changin Times, 102 Days That Shaped a Generation. You can also see Al's work frequently splintered and arrayed in the Beatle album series from our mutual friend and acquaintance, Bruce Spizer. Here is the latest edition of that, where you'll see Al's work, The Beatles: A Hard Day's Night, and more. Al, welcome to Why the Beatles Matter. I'm so grateful that you're here, pal.
Hi, Sean. Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
I have to say, one of the things that really impresses me about your work is the lens in which you put your love for the Beatles, in the lens of history and culture and so many other things, film, music, pop culture. And I think let's just start there. I've got students that are tuning in. I've got new and enduring fans of the Beatles tuning in. So if we were to kind of give you this prompt, how do we put the Beatles in a historic context?
In a historic context, well, actually, I mean, their arrival in this country really kind of you could say that the '60s kind of kind of were launched, at least in to some extent, by their arrival in this country.
Hmm.
And also the development of their music and and pop culture. Of course, they had a lot of assistance, you could say,
Hmm.
by all that was going on around them in pop culture, both in England and here as well.
Absolutely. There's a lot of response there's kind of a simultaneous thing going on in the history of the Beatles. There's a response to what is happening in the world. There's a response to their upbringing in Liverpool. There's a response to the things that they devoured as
Mm-hmm.
as friends, whether it was Elvis, Little Richard, Marlon Brando, James Dean, and then they were also kind of creating along the way this kind of path of innovation and
Mm-hmm.
expression and creativity.
Exactly. And the fact that within, really about a year after after they arrived in America, um, the sort of their influential tentacles began to be spread back to them
Hmm.
by the response of a lot of these young bands that had formed as a result of, well, specifically the February 9th, '64 Ed Sullivan Show. And so while there were also the real, the kids my age, I was 14 when they broke in America, and like Bruce Springsteen, who's about a month younger than me, Billy Joel was 3 months younger than me, Tom Petty, Steve Van Zandt, people like that, immediately began either forming bands or growing their hair or whatever, and then you had guys that were a little bit older, like well, at that point, Jim McGuinn, who later became Roger McGuinn,
The Birds.
but the Birds, who by that summer was already the summer of '64, was already performing in village coffee houses doing Beatles
Yeah.
songs, and which got the attention of a couple of other folkies, Gene Clark and David Crosby,
Hmm.
and that led to the formation of the Birds. And then you've got what was going on in Laurel Canyon, which was also a reaction um, uh, to the influence of the Beatles. So the tentacles the tentacles were spread out and then came back to them because they became very influenced by the Birds, by
Yes.
Bob Dylan, and et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely, beautifully said. And you mentioned February 1964, and we are in the waning days of 2024,
Right.
a great kind of winter of celebration in Beatle world with the 60th anniversary of the Beatles' arrival in America, and the British invasion and the appearance on Ed Sullivan, and all of that is so beautifully captured in Bruce Spizer's recent book, which you've contributed to, The Hard Day's Night and More. And what I'd like, we joked before we hit record of how I'm, not so much a first generation fan, like I
Right.
just got in it, but you were there at age 14, and
Mm-hmm.
what was that like? What was that experience like? In February of '64, from your place at the table.
The funny thing is, actually, I'm a little different in that I I actually resisted for
Wow.
probably about 6 weeks.
Uh huh.
They actually won me over themselves with their performance on not the February 9th Sullivan show, but the February 16th one from Miami Beach.
Wow.
And but I had because I when I first heard I Want to Hold Your Hand, it was on a Tuesday night, January 7th, 1964.
Hmm.
And I'm as a teacher, you'll appreciate that. I'm a I'm ostensibly doing my homework, but in reality,
Good for you.
well, yeah, except that what I was really doing was listening to WABC, which was at that point becoming the biggest top 40 station in America.
Hmm.
They had 50,000 watt signal that you could hear in 38 states at night. And I'm listening on Tuesday night was their new survey, and I would generally would listen just to see what was at the top of their survey each week. And so I'm listening to um, each song, and in the because the DJ Scott Muni, who later became a pioneer in FM rock
That's
in New
right.
York. And but at that time he was a top 40 DJ, and he is playing the top seven on 77 WABC.
Hmm.
Um, and each song's coming, and there's not much movement, and I'm trying to figure what's the number one song. So he gets to number one, and on comes first of all these power chords that sounded like they were coming from Mars, and um, and it was a record I had never heard by a group I had never heard
Wow.
called the Beatles, and it was "I Want to Hold Your Hand," obviously. And my immediate reaction was, as one used to doo wop, folk music,
Hmm.
girl groups, brill building, pop, was negative. I thought, because it was just so different
Hmm.
that it was, I couldn't get it. And then the next couple of days at school, all these girls at school are going crazy over this group that, probably they hadn't heard of a week earlier.
Right. Wow.
There were a few, as I've discovered over the years, there were a few early birds who got in during '63, but
Mhm.
most kids had never really heard of them before the beginning of '64. So I just built up this wall of resistance, and that just continued for probably, as I said, about 6 weeks. Even the February 9th Sullivan show, I went in very much with a, you know, okay, Beatles, show me type of attitude. And the February 9th show didn't actually do it, at least not for me,
Wow.
and but it was the show the following week in Miami Beach that that actually did it. In fact, if I assume you've seen Beatles '64, right? Um, and actually, the moment that made me a fan is in that film, and that's their performance of "This Boy"
I knew it.
from that second Sullivan show.
Wow.
Because I had, like I said, I had listened to a lot of doo wop in the early '60s. I have an older brother who used to smuggle a radio into the bedroom and listen to Alan Freed, and
Nice.
this is in the mid and late '50s, and Jocko's Rocket Ship Show out of Philadelphia, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
And so I was fairly fluent in like doo wop music, and I just thought that, especially with the three Beatles around the microphone
Yeah.
and all, and then on the bridge, Paul and George, falling away while
Yep.
John is doing that verse, I thought was just very, very cool.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much what made me a fan.
Wow. What a vivid and beautiful picture painted there, and that performance of this boy, because I figured as you were talking about it, it's got to be that moment where
Mm-hmm.
John just it's otherworldly, and it's a sublime moment, and beautiful three-part harmony, all there. It really is a stunning moment. Now, I dug Beatles '64. I know there's been a little bit of backlash, and
Mm-hmm.
I put this in the context of, um, it, gosh, I shared this with you before we hit record, that growing up as a fan of the Beatles in starting really 1980 and onward. um, there is no internet. There is no MTV yet.
Mm-hmm.
There is no Beatles fan club that I knew of in Winston Salem, North Carolina. It was just friends whose old albums I would borrow. I had a neighbor
Mm-hmm.
down the street who had the Red album and the Beatles rarities, and so those were like that was my food. And then
Sure.
occasionally a radio show um, here in North Carolina, 107.5 WKZL had Beatle Break, and they would play three
Mm-hmm.
Beatles songs at noon. And I remember setting up my little tape recorder and hitting getting one of those 180-minute tapes or whatever it was before I went to school, or and asking my mom to hit record so that I could hear those three songs, or sneaking a radio into the bathroom, and listening. Um, so anything that was coming from Beatle World, whether it was Beatlemania or the Beatle rarities or the Beatles cartoon, I I I would go for, and it was
Mm-hmm.
and releases were few and far in between. So anything like Beatles '64, I was satisfied with. I thought it was a well-made film.
Yeah.
I thought the technology, the technical aspects, that Washington Coliseum concert, blew me away. Those opening notes
Hmm.
of "Long Tall Sally" from Paul, which just kind
Hmm.
of leap out of the speaker and take you into the stratosphere. Stunning. So I value those things. I value those scraps that whatever's coming from Apple, whatever's coming from the Beatles, I appreciate, because there was a time, pre classic rock Renaissance radio, pre everything, that those things were few and far in between. So I appreciated it.
Hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. It was, I in looking at it, in fact, my lady Janine, who is, just a casual fan, um,
Yeah.
she really, she she really enjoyed it, and it was, it really was, made for, I would say, a more mainstream audience. It wasn't made for hardcore Beatles fans, and so the fact that they're the ones that are nitpicking about it, and plus the fact that, because I didn't realize going in that it was only covering those 2 weeks.
Same here.
Yeah, and there's not a whole lot of material from those 2 weeks, because, for instance, the Carnegie Hall show was
Yes.
never recorded because of musicians union rules. And so you've really just got the three Sullivan shows, and they're already, available on DVD,
Right.
in their entirety. You've got the Washington Coliseum concert, and that's actually been available, at least through iTunes, for 13 years now.
Hmm.
So that's been out there. So there's really nothing, and so other than that, there's just the Maisels brothers footage.
Yeah.
So really, I suppose it's I think people were comparing this to the first U.S. visit, which was
Not a bad film.
which, as far as I'm concerned, I think is pretty much the definitive, video document of
Hmm.
those 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So people who I guess were expecting more than that. No, there's nothing else.
Yeah, there's nothing else, I mean, you could go back and look at the first U.S. visit. But again, the way I look at it is, if Beatles '64 is is that gateway for that new fan, and I think in many ways that's how I there's two layers of that film. You can look at it as, okay, here's this kind of exploration of this brief moment in time. You can look at it as in the context of the Kennedy assassination, and I think it's well done.
Hmm.
Um, but then also, we're still talking about this band that broke up, over 50 years ago,
Hmm.
and there are new generations of fans. There has to
Absolutely.
be a landing point. There has to be an entry point somewhere or the other. For me, it was a teacher. For me,
Hmm.
it was a neighbor who had Beatle records. So I applaud the film, and grateful that it's out, for somebody who it was always looking forward to, and trying to track down, Beatle Fan Magazine, which you're the executive editor of, and I'm very grateful for that publication too, because it validated my passion. It let me know that I wasn't crazy, that there are other people that were into some of the arcane deep dives of
Hmm.
B-sides and bootlegs, and there were these gatherings. So, and I'd love for you to kind of talk a little bit about Beatle Fan Magazine, and your place in it, and what it means to you.
Well, that was in February of 1979.
Mm.
I was at the what at that time was still called Beatle Fest, and it was the first time that I was kind of there as uh, an insider, if you will. And Mark Lapidus had asked me to be on a panel there.
Hmm.
It was the first time that I'd ever been on a panel of that type, sort of similar to what you did,
That's great.
back a few years ago. And but also when going through the flea market, which in those days was huge, um, I saw this table and these two Southerners from Decatur, Georgia, Bill and Leslie King, and their new publication called Beatle Fang. And it looked different from the at least the fanzines and things like that it looked like they had been done on a mimeograph machine.
Hmm.
So it looked professional, and it looked like it might have some meat to it. So I picked up a copy of I think there were two issues that were available at that point, and read them and enjoyed them. And then I guess about the middle of that year, maybe the third or fourth issue after I subscribed, um, Bill had a little piece. And he was soliciting for a New York correspondent. So I thought, okay, I'd been doing, had been a columnist for a gold mine type record store freebie called Sounds Fine, but that was coming to an end. So I thought, yeah, I'll sign up for this, or at least a volunteer. And so I did that, and that basically what that entailed was basically getting material that was in the newspapers and anything relating to the Beatles, and and basically putting it in a Manila envelope and sending it all down to Georgia, and and then I get toward the end of the year, I suggested a couple of pieces, and so I think it was the last issue of the first year of Beatle Fan that I had my first two pieces. One of which was a kind of a takedown of the Dick Clark Birth of the Beatles
I remember that. Yeah.
film, and the other was kind of like sort of an open letter suggesting that Beatle fans might be interested in listening to new wave music, which was a little presumptuous, considering that it was the first time that I had, you know, appeared in the magazine.
Hmm.
Um, and so that was the last issue of the first year.
Well,
And
you were probably vindicated a little bit by the new wave bit because it was later revealed that what part of what brought John Lennon out of
yes,
his kind of moratorium on recording was the B-52s.
yes,
Very famously turned to Yoko and said, "Hey, mother, I think they're ready for us now."
mm-hmm,
And then of course Paul exploring a little bit of that sensibility, and McCartney too, that famous
mm-hmm,
DIY album, which has the hit Coming Up, which also
sure,
prompted, inspired John to kind of, I think Paul's onto something. Maybe I need to,
mm-hmm.
write something as well. So there's a little bit of validation, but I got to tell you, man, the birth of the Beatles again. Um, I, Probably not the most accurate
No,
portraits, but a fun romp. I
mm-hmm.
mean, I'm hopeful about the upcoming Sam Mendes four part biopic, which seems to be
Mhm.
interesting on the Beatles, and still a lot of speculation about who's going to play, what Beatle and all of that.
Mhm.
Um, but kind of the other thing in recent current events, and I'd love to hear your take on, it's a song that just hasn't gone away. Is Now and Then, what is billed as the last Beatles song, and a song that I've written about and podcasted about, and I'd just love to hear your kind of take on it and your thoughts on it.
The funny thing is, I really kind of have a strong suspicion that the people who really get Now and Then are those of us from the first generation,
Yeah,
because I don't know, a lot of the, sort of the Gen Xers who are, probably more into the solo music anyway. They tend to, it was like when it came out, it was kind of like, oh yeah, I've got the, the turquoise see-through with polka dots vinyl, and they couldn't care less about the song.
yeah,
It's the amazing thing is that it's not, the original song, and I'm sure you've heard
hmm,
John Lennon's demo. It's not a great, well, obviously not a great recording, but I mean, it's not even a really good John Lennon song, and yet somehow
yeah,
Paul and Giles Martin and Ringo were able to turn it into really, what you could really call like their valedictory statement.
yeah, yeah.
And and at least I find that a very moving recording. It I get the old constricted throat
Yeah, same here,
almost
man.
any time I hear it.
Yeah, it's a very moving piece of music, and especially when you hear, and I remember hearing about this, reading about it in Beatle Fan actually,
Right.
about this third song that was going to come out, and there was different speculation and what it was, and it didn't work
Mm-hmm.
out, and it was put away, and then. Paul would mention it every so often in an interview that hey,
Mm-hmm.
there was a third song, but it didn't work. And then to kind of hear it and to hear it as this kind of finished piece,
Mm-hmm.
which again is a testament, an enduring testament to the four of them, their collaboration. The fact that Lennon and McCartney, although most of their recorded songs that we know as the Beatles, were written separately, and every now and then there may be a contribution from John or Paul on their respective songs, and of course the
Mm-hmm.
early hits it was the both of them eyeball to eyeball.
Absolutely.
But the fact that they took this demo and Paul and Ringo and George and Giles Martin and all involved, Jeff Lynne and the '95 recording were able to
Mm-hmm.
kind of. I love how you worded that, a valedictory statement, because that's exactly what it is. Even the
Yeah.
video, which is hard for me to look at,
Yes.
getting emotional,
Getting
and
verklempt.
yes, very much verklempt. I'm also excited to see how the Grammys, which I know has had kind of a mixed relationship with the Beatles over the years. They haven't always been nominated for what I felt they should have been nominated for, and they didn't always win for what I felt
Mm-hmm.
was deserving. It'll be interesting to see how this plays up, because I believe it was nominated for two awards.
It was nominated for Record of the Year. The problem is that they're in the same category with all of the biggest pop stars of the day.
Yes,
They're in there with Sabrina Carpenter and Taylor Swift and Beyonce
yeah,
and Post Malone and a couple of others, and then even in the rock performance category,
hmm,
they're in there with Pearl Jam and the Black Keys and another one of the on like, in the kind of like modern rock, some other, you know, luminaries.
Right.
And so I wouldn't really expect them to win either of those. Certainly not record of the year.
I
You know,
hear you. I don't want to believe you, Al, but I'm hopeful. I'm
yes,
hopeful. I think
of
I think
course.
unfortunately I think you're right. I don't want you to be right,
Oh yeah.
um,
Oh
and I'm
no,
hoping.
that would be the miracle on ice
Yes,
in 1980. This
nice.
would be the miracle of the Grammys.
The miracle of Christ. Do you believe in miracles?
Exactly.
Yes. Well, we're gonna try to manifest that, man, in some way,
Hmm.
and hopeful that the song does receive its just rewards. But then again, I think in the context of, and I don't want to be that Beatles fan that is nitpicky and ungrateful, because there was a time when there was no any kind of inkling of any kind of reunion,
Hmm.
and the fact that, I mean, I remember getting chills watching the Beatles anthology when it first aired,
Sure.
and seeing at the very beginning, there's a moment. I've talked about this with another colleague on another podcast, but the moment where, at the very beginning of episode one, where you see modern day Paul McCartney and modern day George Harrison
Hmm.
together, and they're aping Bisa Mucho, and they're going cha cha boom, and I remember
Yes.
like, whoa, because you never saw the two of them ever,
Yeah.
it just the two of them in any kind
Hmm.
of photograph. It may have been Ringo and Paul and George at Ringo's wedding to Barbara Bach, but the two of them never
Hmm.
ever did anything together that we know of in post breakup. So I remember like, whoa, I'm just grateful for that. I'm just grateful for a picture of the three of them smiling, um,
Sure.
and seeing them together. So again, I don't want to. We just got to be grateful we have the last Beatles song out there, and it's
Absolutely.
amazing.
And I can remember at the end of that episode of the
Yes,
anthology was that countdown
yes,
of, going into the video of Free as a Bird. Now, at that point, I'm like 45 years old, and yet my heart was going like a jackhammer. Like I was 15 again, like I was back in 14 years old in
yeah.
1964. It was an amazing, amazing moment,
And
and
and when you hear Paul, for me the moment, because hearing that countdown, and I'm like, oh my god, new Beatles song, and it didn't become real for me until I heard Paul singing his verse, the whatever happened to the middle part. And I'm like, oh wow, that's when I got chills. I'm like, wait a minute, because again, Ringo had played with
mm-hmm,
John. George had played with John, and so you're trying to wrap your head around like, okay, is
yeah,
this a Beatles song or not? And then it didn't
mm-hmm,
become real for me until Paul started singing, and I just remember,
yeah,
I was 25, and I remember
yeah.
just sinking onto the floor, gobsmacked by that moment. What besides February '64, what's another kind of standout for you as a first generation fan, where you felt that kind of, that okay, I get the band, or the band's got me? Was there another kind of moment that you experienced in the trajectory of being a first generation fan?
Um, I think there was a couple of things actually. One is the one was because I kind of went along for once I became a fan. I kind of went along for the ride, the musical ride.
Hmm.
And so I really was into their development as a musical entity. And Rubber Soul, which is still one of my three favorite Beatles albums.
Nice.
I can't do one. I can,
Same here.
I can give you three because the others are Abbey Road and The Whiteout. But when that came out, it was again, it was the culmination of so much of what was going on in '65 and so much of what they were absorbing. And I absolutely loved it on first listen. And I remember going and playing it for some friends, and they really were not, it wasn't, for Jolly Mop Tops music,
Yeah.
I guess. Even though over that year, their their music had been maturing and transitioning out of that very early period, but they didn't really, they weren't really thrilled. And then when Revolver came out,
Hmm.
it was even more so. I really liked. I didn't like it as much as Rubber Soul, but I thought it was a great album. And then played it for people, and the negative reaction, at least out of the box, was even more so.
Hmm.
So, and in fact, where I lived in North Jersey in those days, the Rascals were
Yes.
absolute gods. And I can remember, this would be in like early '67, and there were friends who were telling me the Rascals are better than the Beatles.
Wow.
And by this time, Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields had come out, and there were already reports about the sessions for what became Sergeant Pepper.
Hmm.
And I'm thinking, yeah, yeah, the Rascals are better. Well, in a few months, you'll find out. and sure, and sure enough, you know,
Absolutely. I dig the Rascals, and now I'm hearing grooving in my head.
sure.
But I think the Rascals would be quick to say themselves, hey, well,
Oh, no question.
yeah, we're not, we're good, but we're not the Beatles,
Yes. Yeah.
That's a neat take, Al. I appreciate that. The man, the thing about Rubber Soul, just to kind of the question here, was it the American version? I take it that for
Yes.
you,
Yeah.
yeah. That,
Although, now in those days, a lot of times, the top 40 radio stations, who basically lived on getting, exclusives on Beatles records. I mean, I can remember, WMCA in New York got a copy of, this is in June of '65, got a copy of The Night Before, which sounded like it was recorded over the telephone.
wow,
And they played it, for, again, maybe a day or so before Nat Weiss, who was the Beatles' lawyer,
yeah,
uh, gave them a cease and desist order. And of course, it was always, well, Ringo sent this to us,
yeah,
that sort of thing. But in December, a lot of times, especially since, if you look at the release schedules, the a lot of times the British albums would come out maybe a week or so before the American ones, and that was the case with Rubber Soul. And so I believe WABC got a copy of it and was playing the four tracks from it that were not on the American album. And the first one that absolutely grabbed me by the throat was Nowhere Man.
wow.
That's got to, again, I can't give you one, but if I'm forced to name my favorite Beatles songs, Nowhere Man is absolutely in there.
Oh, stunning,
And
stunning
yeah.
record,
Mm-hmm.
stunning record,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the
Mm-hmm.
three-part harmony again for
Yes.
you,
Yep. Exactly. Yep. This Boy, Yes It Is, songs like that are just, all of which were written by John Lennon, oddly enough.
Yeah. I've mentioned to many people, and this is an album the album that probably gets the least amount of love in the Beatles canon is the 1970 album Let It Be. And it's my favorite album. As I mentioned, the album and I came out on the same day, May 8th, 1970.
Right.
And I love Abbey Road. I love Revolver. I love all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard for me to kind of pinpoint, um, like I don't have a favorite Beatle. I love all four of them.
Right.
But Let It Be for me is an album that I love, and it's my number one. Why is it, Al, in your opinion? And you were a young adult when it came out. Why does that album not get a lot of love? And it really wasn't until the release of the Get Back Peter Jackson documentary, in
Mm-hmm.
which everybody jumped on the Let It Be bandwagon, and and I'm like, well, welcome to the club, everybody. I've been beating this drum for 30 years
Mm-hmm.
on Let It Be, and there's a lot of layers to that album that Al
Sure.
appreciates. But why does that album not get a lot of love?
I think there's actually a few reasons. One is, I mean, the most obvious one is that when it was released, it was just about a month after Paul released the self interview in which he said he had no plans to work with the Beatles again, which was not an announcement of a breakup,
Yeah,
but still it was enough of a break that basically the world interpreted it as him saying, well, what was I think it was the Daily Mail had the front page headline,
yeah. Paul quits the
Paul is
Beatles.
quitting the Beatles.
Yeah,
And so I think that's part of it. So, there was kind of like an anticlimax. Also, a lot of us had heard a lot of the songs from it in
yeah,
advance
that's
because
right.
through bootlegs,
Yeah,
which had really just started to become a factor in 69 and 70. And so a lot of us heard the acetate that had been leaked of the original, I guess, I'm not sure which of the Glyn Johns versions,
hmm,
but I think may have been the second one that was leaked to WBCN in Boston and to other radio stations, and then appeared on bootlegs. So a lot of us had heard those songs already. And then there was also the whole controversy over the Long and Winding Road.
yeah,
And there are people to this day who debate whether Spector adding all of the strings and a choir and the harp that Paul hates
yeah.
and all, whether that's whether it was appropriate or whatever. And then, whereas there are a lot of people that like the stripped down version from the original Get Back album,
Hmm.
and I've never really had a problem with it. In fact, at that point, since that was the first single that was released from Let It Be after its original release, after it finally came out. Um, and so after, again, Paul's self interview, it kind of appeared that that would be, at least for some time, their last record. And so it had, I forget where it was. I think it may have been in Rolling Stone that somebody said that it kind of was a nice punctuation mark
Yeah,
for their career as a band, since we didn't know if there were, at that point there was no precedent for a band of that stature to break up and then get back together.
right.
And so I think all told, the fact that the sort of the post breakup hangover, the fact that a lot of us had heard a lot of the songs on it previously, and the controversy over the Long and Winding Road um, probably contributes. But of course, that doesn't that doesn't take into account the younger folks like you who didn't hear it until years and years later.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe just as a as a collection of songs, it may not be up to, obviously, the album that immediately precedes it, well, actually succeeded it
Yes.
as far as when it was recorded, Abbey Road, which is just a brilliant album. So maybe by comparison, Let It Be is not quite in that class, and then of course the albums that immediately preceded Abbey Road, the White Album and Sergeant Pepper, and the whole catalog. So really, it's the two albums that I guess, get the most sort of disrespect, if you will, from fans,
Yeah.
are Let It Be, and as I just wrote about it's in the new issue of Beatle Fan,
Yay.
product placement, Beatles for Sale, which gets an awful lot of crap
Yes.
from younger, uh, as I call them, the youngins. Of course, to me, a youngin is 60. And it seems like the younger generations of fans, for whatever reason, whether it's the picture on the cover or Mr. Moonlight or whatever, they just don't like that album for whatever reason. And so that, and Let It Be, and I guess Please Please Me, only because um, it's their, basically their, the sort of, embryonic journey, if you will,
Yeah.
you know, with early Beatles originals, and then balanced out by their covers. So I guess those three albums are the ones that seem to get the most abuse, if you will.
That's a great take, Al. Because but all three of those albums, they're 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 kind of like transitional albums. So like Please Please
Yes,
Me is the entry point. It's a new band, so to
right.
speak, because you've got Ringo in the band that they're hungry. This is their cavern set. This is there's no identifiable um, paradigm in the
Mm-hmm.
context. There's no context.
Sure.
At one, it's not Lennon and McCartney. If I'm not mistaken, they were billed as the songwriting partnership was McCartney and Lennon.
Yeah,
On certain, somewhere on the liner notes or
yeah.
someplace, or in some of the sheet music.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't. But here's the thing: you can't land on "She Loves You" or "I Want to Hold Your Hand" or "This Boy" until you've established "I Saw Her Standing There," "Misery," "Chains," "Twist and
Mm-hmm.
Shout." You know what I'm saying? And then the same thing for Beatles for Sale. Now I love "Mr. Moonlight." That's one of my favorite Beatles songs,
Mm-hmm.
which gets does not get a whole lot of love, but my God,
No.
John's vocal
Yeah.
is stunning on
Sure.
that show. It's on that song, but again, you can't land in Help and Rubber Soul, that world, until you get through
Sure.
Beatles for Sale, where they're
Yeah.
starting. Okay, every little thing. Mr. Moonlight, No Reply, I'm a Loser.
Mm-hmm. I'm a loser. Yeah.
Whew. And then and then Let It Be, in many ways, if you put it in the context of, yes, it's the punctuation, it's the epilogue, but in many ways it's and I love the liner notes of that album, New Phase. And in many ways, it's not the new phase of the Beatles. It's the new phase as what Tracy Taylor talks about in the last episode of the recovery Beatles and the recovery Beatles
Hmm.
trying to make sense of what the last 8 years and to try to find their own identity. And you hear that, I think, coming out in different places of 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 that album. You don't get to Ram. You don't get to All Things Must Pass. Imagine, Sentimental Journey
Hmm.
without Let It Be, and so I really I never looked at it, Let It Be, in the context of those two other albums, which don't get a lot of love. That, hey, that might be a an essay for you, for or a piece for next issue of Beatle Fan.
Well, as a matter of fact, in that new issue, which just reached my mailbox yesterday, I do have a piece on basically defending Beatles for Sale, and also the Beatles story, which also gets an awful lot of crap
Yes.
from people. Yeah.
Yes, it does. I'm glad it came out in the new box set, because again, for a fan like me, like I remember getting that on cassette. I don't have it anymore, but sadly, but like, man, okay, here's there was snatches of Beatles songs, but still there was literally it's their story. It's the interviews. It was part of my encyclopedia. It was part of my formation. So
And it's a nice little kind of time capsule
yeah,
from of that particular time, because it's, I mean, the much of the script is taken from fan magazines, and it was put together. It's kind of an artifact of that, of the period when radio stations, local radio stations, had their own news departments, and so that album is anchored by uh, three newsmen from LA radio
that's
stations,
right.
and it's produced by two songwriters and producers who were very much a part of the LA surf and hot rod music scene. And so putting all of that together, like I said, it's just a very it's and also, frankly, the background music of the Hollywood Strings,
That's right.
which very much the fellow who did their arrangements, a fellow named Stu Phillips,
That's right.
when he did those albums of Beatles songs, accentuated the melodies, and
Yes.
that really, I think, made those songs more palatable to adults hearing it on, say, whatever easy listening radio station happened to be on in a restaurant or something. And somebody would think, wait a minute, and hearing that's that's a Beatles song, you know, that's that's not bad, you
Yeah,
know,
it's got it's
that
got a
that
nice beat. You can dance to it,
yeah,
and
yeah, exactly. So all together, then the Beatles story is, like I said, just a nice little time capsule. And the fact that younger people think it's quaint or whatever, doesn't, they don't really get it.
I appreciate that take as well, Al, and Stu Phillips. For those that are tuning in, here's a little bit of arcane knowledge. He did all the incidental music for the Monkees TV show. Um,
Right?
he
Yeah.
did so, and credited quite heavily, and of course the Holly Ridge Strings albums are phenomenal to listen to.
Hmm.
Great fun, and I know one of the producers that you mentioned or alluded to. Also, I think both of them had connections to the Beach Boys. Uh, One of them being Gary Usher,
Right. And the
who
other was Roger Christian,
Roger Christian, and both
who,
co-wrote various. I think Roger Christian co-wrote a lot of the Car songs with Brian Wilson,
yes,
and Gary Usher co-wrote that beautiful precursor to Pet Sounds and Rubber Soul, In My Room.
yes.
Um, and he produced a lot of other one of my all time favorite Birds albums, the Notorious Bird Brothers, Suitcase
Hmm.
and Rodeo. So I, I've often, and I've never shared this before, Al, and I feel this is a safe space, man. Um, but I often, in recent years, I consider the Beatles story. This is a bold statement, and I'm just going to go there because it's my podcast.
Hey,
Um, but I consider the Beatles story to be, if not the first, one of the earliest examples of a podcast.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
If you think
Because a
about it,
lot of the production values
yeah.
that go into podcasts now went into a production like that. Yeah, no question.
So I would say for the crate diggers out there, or if you come across Beatles story, or it has been reissued on
Hmm.
Capitol, you can get it in the box set, or you can get it as the standalone um, reissued album. I don't pass over it, and it is an album that does not get any love.
No, not at
In the
all.
mainstream, it's usually you see it as 1 star or half a star or not
Yes.
recommended. but it is a great artifact, and
Hmm.
perhaps the first podcast. So if Paul or Ringo are tuning in, go take run with that. You
Yeah.
can have it.
Hmm.
Might have to blog about that next time. But Al, I have really enjoyed our time together. I've enjoyed our conversation, just as I am enriched by your words and your writings over the years in Beatle Fan Magazine and in Bruce Spizer's books. I am equally enriched talking to you in real time through the magic of Zoom.
Well, I've enjoyed it. It's been a quick session. I'll tell you. It's been very enjoyable.
Well, thank you, and you have an open seat to return again, and look forward to the upcoming work and words from you. Always appreciated. For folks who want to connect with you or to follow your work, what's the best way?
Probably the easiest. I mean, I'm on Facebook. As Al Sussman, and otherwise you could contact me through BeatleFan, BeatleFan.com. But probably, like I said, probably the easiest is just if they're, if they're on Facebook, because I don't. That's about. I did finally just recently go on the Blue Sky.
I saw that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Mainly because of the politics of the moment.
I hear
You
you,
know,
man.
like I, I won't put you through the that whole monologue. Uh,
Well, I appreciate your diplomacy
yes.
and candidness, and I would say if you're for those of you who are fortunate to follow Al on Facebook, he is great about sharing and supporting, sharing not only Beatle tidbits and previews for Beatle Fan Magazine, but also is better than any kind of on this day in history calendar that you will ever find. And I'm always grateful when Al will post either an anniversary of some event or a celebrity birthday or a forgotten name in history that I have forgotten about. Like, oh wow, they're 97. Oh my gosh, or this happened 72 years ago.
Hmm.
So I always appreciate the journalistic and historic lens in which Al puts all things. And of course, I will put all of those links to Beatle Fan Magazine. Which reminds me, Al, I need to re up my subscription. So I will be inspired to do that and to go to BeatleFan.com and to do that. And of course, I will put that link in the show notes. Al Sussman, thank you so much for being a part of Why the Beatles Matter.
Thank you so much, Sean. I appreciate it very much.
This is Sean Gaylord, and this is Why the Beatles Matter with Al Sussman, who has definitely living proof of every bit of the title of this podcast. And I'm very grateful for him and his time and his expertise. As always, thank you for tuning in and continue, just like our Beatles, to stay fab.